Back then, the big issue was the White Plantation Agreement. And the right-wingers in his cabinet in those days said, if you sign this agreement, we will pull out and there will be elections. And that's exactly what happened. They brought the government down. There were elections. And Netanyahu was not doing well in the polls. And Ehud Barak beat him by the widest landslide in Israeli history up to that point. So again, he has shown a willingness to commit political suicide if he thinks it's in the national interest. As for the argument itself, it's laughable. Hamas is psychopathic, but they're not stupid. Before they sign on to any such deal, it is going to be guaranteed by America, Russia, the EU, China, Turkey, Egypt. There's going to be a UN Security Council resolution. Everyone is going to obligate itself to make sure Israel doesn't go back to war. The idea that Israel could just cast this aside and go back to war, it's ridiculous. It's an absurdist position, but people present it anyway, even serious people, all because of their blind hatred of Netanyahu.
Yeah, I think, also, we've heard these arguments before. This was the argument in 2005 during the withdrawal from Gaza, when Israel withdrew every settlement and soldier from Gaza, as he said, and ended the occupation of Gaza, even though much of the world still pretends that it was occupied during those years. But Sharon said, well, if they use Gaza to shoot at us, we'll come back in and wipe them out. But of course, Israel didn't do that because it couldn't, because the world wouldn't let them do it. The price would have been, enormous. So these arguments don't really take into account historical reality, because we've already been down this road before.
It's absolutely the case. And what you said a moment ago is so true in the sense that when Israel pulled out, okay, they dismantled every settlement. They even actually, there were cemeteries. They even dug up the people who'd been buried there. They didn't leave a Jewish molecule there. I'll let you in on a little secret. They actually even withdrew beyond Gaza because there's an area called the Tochemet HaTzvonit, which means, I mean, loosely translated, the northern sliver. And it was just that there were 3 settlements and the Erez industrial park there. They even withdrew from there. Now that northern sliver was not built in Gaza. It was actually built in what before 1967 was no man's land. The land between Israeli troops and UN troops, or before that Egyptian troops. Now Israel has just as much claim to no man's land as the Palestinians, but Sharon didn't even want to leave a germ of doubt that he left every granule of sand. And yet, well, here it is. I have it with me. The New York Times published, I have it right here, on September the 20th, 2007, page A12. Here goes. And you can see I cut it out. Mm-hmm. Under international law, Israel is considered an occupying power in Gaza, even though it has removed its troops and settlers from the territory. Which international law is that one? This is not like some crazy thing that slipped out while the editor was on vacation. This is every single story in the New York Times from 2005 right up to the attack that, yes, they withdrew, but it's really under occupation. So, and therefore Israel owes Gaza.
This idea that it's an open air prison, which is, it does not conform to the reality of what Gaza was before October 7th.
Well, that's laughable as well, because, again, this is where it literally becomes comical. Before October 7th, excuse me, first of all, Israel was supplying Gaza, and the conditions there economic weren't even all that bad. So in some, open air prison, the New York Times, by the way, called it a draconian blockade. So I looked it up. In the last year before the war in 2022, Israel supplied Gaza with 5.7 billion gallons of water, 67,000 trucks filled with supplies, food, clothing, baby formula, you name it, 2/3 of Gaza's electricity, all of its fuel. 17,000 Gazan Palestinians had license to work in Israel and take home a paycheck. So far from a draconian blockade, it was the only war in the history of the world where one side was supplying the other. And wait, people in Gaza could leave if they wanted to. They could go out through Rafah. Humanitarian cases could go through Israel, and they could go anywhere they wanted to. Now that President Trump has talked about a voluntary immigration program, the very groups that accuse Israel of an open-air prison are saying, no, you can't have them leave. If they leave, you're depopulating. In other words, they want to turn it into an open-air prison.
Yeah.
Agnes Calamard, the like nutty executive director of Amnesty International, who has this long record of saying absolutely crazy things about Israel, she has put forth this argument that by allowing people to leave because they're not rebuilding it, they're therefore compelling them to leave. Therefore, it's really a genocide or something like that, or depopulating or ethnic cleansing. So first of all, the Israelis are not forcing anyone to leave. They can stay if they want. They've announced that anyone who wants to come back can come back. So that doesn't sound like ethnic cleansing to me. But again, before the war, she was saying it was an open air prison. Now she wants to turn it into an open air prison.
Yeah, just complete. Yes, cognitive dissonance, as you said before. Now, you note in your book's concluding chapter that most Palestinians share, quote unquote, Hamas's values. In practice, what has that meant? And do you believe that this really does doom any attempt at any kind of solution to the conflict, the two states or whatever you want to call it, for the foreseeable future?
So first, let's talk about what that attitude means. Okay. If I were to ask you, what is the role and the function of government? You would probably say, it's to improve the lives of the citizenry. And then you might shrug and say, was that a trick question? I mean, isn't that obvious? Okay, to them, it's not so obvious. To them, the purpose of government is to spread radical Islam. That's the most important value. It's the same for Iran. It's the same for ISIS. It's the same for any radical Islamic ideology. They want to spread radical Islam to the exclusion of everything else. And that is why, even though, Iran experiences power outages every single day, and even though they've got a lot of inflation, they're still spending most of their money supporting the Houthis, supporting Hezbollah, supporting, that's the most important priority to them. What's it going to take to have a peace treaty? It's going to take a change in that attitude. Now, what would bring about a change in that attitude? The only thing I see is military pressure. There was a time when people thought the German people could never change. Winston Churchill once said, a Hun, that was the slur in those days, a Hun armed is a war in prospect. But what do you know? After losing the war and having their country demolished, they did change. I'm not looking for bloodshed or suffering for no reason, but maybe this is what has to happen for the Palestinian people to finally realize that this just is not the way to go. I don't have a better idea. I wish I did.
Yeah. Now, you also devote a chapter of your book to the rise of J Street, the left-wing lobby here in the United States. Though their views are irrelevant to the realities of the Middle East and the point of view of the overwhelming majority of Israelis, why have they retained legitimacy in the eyes of outlets like the New York Times? And do you think they are being replaced on the American Jewish left by those who are more honest about their opposition to Zionism and even to their left?
It's a good question. I don't honestly know what motivates these people. I mean, I do know what motivates them. They want to fight racism. And that's why they've gone behind every single, whether it's Black Lives Matter or anything else. That is how they view the world. In their worldview, white people are oppressing people of color. That's how they see this. They are not the role they play is they give anti-Israel people political cover. So they could say, well, I'm just, like J Street, I'm pro-Israel. I just believe in peace. But then when you look at the things that J Street has done over the years, practically condemning the Abraham Accords, saying it was just a business deal. And when Israel was negotiating, it should even say is negotiating with Saudi Arabia, they've brought back the whole Jimmy Carter linkage idea. They're saying, well, no, don't do a peace treaty. We need something for the Palestinians as well. That's why people on Capitol Hill are saying it's going to be so difficult to get a deal done with the Saudis, because the Saudis made it clear, certainly before October 7th, they don't really care about the Palestinians. They really want to get this deal done. And they have a lot of reasons for getting a deal like this done. But the Democrats are the ones who are saying, no, but we need something for the Palestinians. And, all you could do is just throw up your hands and wonder, why are they so motivated to help the Palestinians when the Palestinians have made it clear they don't even want to live in peace themselves? So why would you torpedo the peace treaty you can have? And think of how important a peace treaty that would be. Why would you torpedo that in the name of a people who refer to Jews as apes and pigs and refuse to live in peace?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of projection, and this sort of it's a mania of the left in which they don't give people like the Palestinians any agency and just see them as a reflection of their own own ideals and own ideas about what should happen and don't actually pay much attention to what the Palestinians actually want.
I could not agree with you more. And, whenever people speak about the suffering of the Palestinian people, the response is really simple. They are suffering. It is terrible. But the solution for that is for the Palestinian people to live in peace. That's it. They could stop it tomorrow. All they have to do is free the hostages. All they have to do is recognize Israel's so-called right to exist. All they have to do is agree to the two-state solution. If they would just do that, all the suffering ends, all the problems go away. I would also point out that Israel is not even asking for that. Israel has put forth what I would have to describe as the most generous terms in the history of warfare, and that is not an exaggeration. You've had this hideous attack. It was started by the Palestinians. No one disputes that, okay? The Israelis are not asking for any compensation. They're not asking for any land. They're not even asking for a peace treaty. Stop and think about that one for a minute. All they're asking is that the hostages be freed and the Palestinian leadership go into exile. And the response to that from many liberals, and it is liberals, imagine their response is, just to put this in a proper context, imagine we're closing in on Berlin. We've had this horrible, hideous war. And now someone says, no, wait, we have to stop. The innocent German civilians are suffering too much. We need a ceasefire. Leave the Nazis in power. Yes, they say they're going to attack us again. Let's rebuild Germany. And yeah, they're going to attack us again. But this is what we have to do because of the innocent German civilians. Okay, no one would say this. It's insanity. And that is why this logic has never been employed against anyone in the history of the world except for Israel. And so what I think liberals have to ask themselves is, why is Israel different? And does everything change because Palestinians are people of color?
Yeah, and the truth is they're treating the Israelis as if they're the Nazis, which is, of course, part of the anti-Semitic, demonization of Israel that is at the core of this war, which is promoted by both the Palestinians and their leftist allies abroad.
Right. And think for a moment about the settlements, okay? The three things on planet Earth that get the worst press is climate change, Vladimir Putin, and Israeli settlements. Everybody loves to hate the settlements, right? Okay, again, let's engage in that same thought experiment. Let's assume every fact of the Arab-Israeli conflict happened exactly the way it did. Let's just change one fact. Let's assume the invaders in 1948 was Germany, not the Arabs. So the UN has a partition plan. Israel says yes. Germany says no, as the Arabs did. Germany invades, as the Arabs did. Germany kills every Jew in Judea, Samaria. They ethnically cleanse it, and they rename it, as the Arabs did. But let's Germanize it, not West Bank. We'll call it Westbankenstaat. And now Germany is in an ethnically cleansed Westbankenstaat for 19 years. It's 1967, and Germany attacks again, as Jordan did. Only this time the Jews win. And now the very people who used to live there show up and say, this is my home. I grew up here. I want my home back. The founder of the settler movement was a guy by the name of Hanan Porat, was in exactly that situation. Do you really think that the New York Times or Christian Amanpour would say, you can't have your home back. This is Westbankenstaat. Germany invaded. They killed all the Jews. The Jews were slaughtered fair and square. Nobody would say it. It's insanity. And that is why in the fall of 1967, no one did say it. That is why the UN Security Council, which is not exactly known for its pro-Israel sympathies, passed Resolution 242, which was worded in a way to leave the door wide open for territorial compromise, which is the only solution here. So the question people have to ask themselves is, does everything change merely because Palestinians and Arabs are people of color? Does that make that case of ethnic cleansing suddenly legitimate? The only one in the history of the world that would be legitimate? Of course it shouldn't. But of course it does. And that's because of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah. Now, one of the main aspects of commentary about the post-October 7th war and the, as you term it, the American Intifada, is the myth that Israel is committing genocide and war crimes in Gaza. What does international law actually say about such conflicts, and is Israel obeying it?
Israel is obeying international law to a degree that no country has probably in history up to this point. And a lot of military analysts like Richard Kemp have said this. Mark Milley said this after, no, it wasn't Mark Milley, it was Martin Dempsey. He was one of the American chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff after Protective Edge. Let's just put this in context. The United States went to war to destroy ISIS. It's called Operation Inherent Resolve. At a time in which fewer than 100 Americans were killed by ISIS on American soil, Barack Obama decided to blow it off the map in parts of Iraq and Syria. Now, we supplied 70% of the air power. The Brits supplied 20%. And the last 10% was Canada, France, Australia, and a bunch of others. So you have a perfect statement of all the enlightened countries of the world. Now, those countries did not want to take casualties. So they did not send in ground troops. The ground troops were Kurds and they were Iraqi security forces. Instead, what we did was we sent our air forces out there and we literally blew every city they had right off the map. The Rand Corporation wrote a history or a semi-official history of the conflict with the Defense Department, as they, often do. It's called Operation Inherent Resolve. It's actually on the internet. Anyone can download it. They describe the city of Mosul, a city about as big as Philadelphia, over 1.3 million people. They described it as effectively destroyed. 2 American colonels estimated the damage there at over $100 billion. And that's only one city. There was Ramadi, there was Raqqa, there was Fallujah, there's all these other places. Ramadi's a city of about 400,000 people. The Rand Corporation described it as, quote, reduced to rubble. This is what we did. The main hospital in Mosul, it's called the Salem Hospital. This happened in December of 2016. CENTCOM issued a statement explaining why. You're entitled to do this under the Geneva Convention, Article 19. It was being used for military purposes. There's a picture of it that was taken by the Associated Press. It's a smoking wreck. And how many civilians did we kill? According to a guy named Hoshyar Zabari, who was Iraq's foreign minister for about 11 years, he was assistant prime minister. He's the head of the Kurdish community. One of the most senior people there. He's also from Mosul. He grew up there. He's from there. He said we killed 40,000 civilians just in Mosul. Again, only one battle. By comparison, Israel has sent in ground troops. They've killed civilians at a rate that was less than 1 civilian to 1 terrorist. These are numbers no one else has achieved. It's been achieved at a terrible price. I don't have to tell you, over 400 Israeli soldiers were killed so far. That's after October the 7th in the battle in Gaza. Many thousands were severely wounded. That's what Israel did. So, I mean, the idea that Israel is committing genocide, it's ridiculous, especially when you look at the fact that the Palestinian population keeps growing, not contracting. So if anything, is Israel's committing genocide in reverse.
Now, a major aspect of the debate within the American Jewish community about the aftermath of October 7th is what we should think about the Biden administration. You write that Biden didn't want Israel to lose, but he also didn't want it to win. What then did he really want to happen? And did he envision a post-war peace settlement with Hamas, kind of in much the same way that Henry Kissinger didn't want a complete defeat of Egypt in 1973, which you've written about? And if so, how wrong-headed was that idea?
Well, you hit it right on the head. He wanted a mixed outcome to match his mixed feelings. That's why they said, don't go into Rafah, which of course they had to do to win the war, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to cut off the flow of weapons from Sinai into Gaza. It was a constant case of tug of war to get the weapons they needed, to get the bombs that they needed. If you remember, if you go back to July of 2024, Israel killed Mohammed Deif, who was, I guess you could say, the chief of staff of the Hamas army. I think it was on July the 17th. This was a major, major blow to Hamas. Deif was something of a legendary figure. In their circles, the Israelis had attempted to assassinate him 7 previous times and failed every one. Each time his stature obviously grew. He was wounded 3 times. The guy seemed to be unkillable. They got him on the 8th try, and it really seemed like Hamas was staggered. And according to reports out of the region, Hamas was starting to get a little more flexible on some of the terms for a hostage deal. But then on July the 25th, Kamala, the vice president,
Kamala
Harris gave a speech where she said, there's been too much suffering and I won't remain silent and Israel can't do this. And after that, Hamas just stopped showing up for the talks at all. They wouldn't even negotiate. And, what's there to say? Again, imagine we're closing in on Berlin and someone says, we got to stop. Look at the poor innocent German civilians are suffering. No one would even think of saying something like that. So, here we are. Again, I don't think they wanted Israel to lose, but I don't think they wanted Israel to win either. They've got very mixed feelings about this conflict.
Yeah. Now, you've already noted, and you wrote in your book about your admiration for Prime Minister Netanyahu, but obviously that's not a view shared by all Israelis, even if they don't hold on to hopes for a land for peace deal. Why is it that Netanyahu is so embattled at home as well as abroad?
It's a really good question. Abroad, it's easy. They have to blame someone. They can't just accept the fact that the Palestinians don't want to live in peace. They refuse the two-state solution. It's as simple as that. So they're constantly making up these tall tales. I mean, I can tell you right now what the debate is. The big debate going back to the 1990s was, which comes first? Is it first the Palestinians agree to live in peace and then they get a state? Or is it first we give them a state and then somehow it all works out because the peace fairy comes? Hard as it is to believe, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres argued for the second. And that is why the Oslo Framework Agreement, it's shocking when you think about it. Israel gave them guns, gave them a security force, gave them money, gave them land, and all they asked in return was that at some point in the future, the Palestinians recognize Israel's so-called right to exist, which, by the way, they never did. It was the Americans who even put in a side letter, no violence. They didn't even ask for that. It's shocking. Benjamin Netanyahu said, no. We're not waiting for the peace fairy because the peace fairy never comes. It's first you got to live in peace, then we give you a state. Common sense. So people say, this shows he doesn't want the two-state solution. It's nonsensical. As far as inside Israel, it's really a lot harder to understand. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Israel, unfortunately, has what I refer to as I don't know any other way to refer to this. It's white minority rule. There are many sources of power. It's obviously not apartheid like that because it's not premised on racism. It's a liberal variant of a very bad idea where you have all of these power centers that are totally not accountable to the people, like the Israeli Supreme Court, where the judges just replace themselves, like the so-called attorney general, who's not a legal advisor. She's basically a legal taskmaster. And again, all of them separated out by law in a way that the elected class cannot control them. He's trying to break that. And that's making the people on the other side lose their minds.
Yeah, I think it's, as much as we rightly speak of a century-old war between Jews and Arabs over possession of the land of Israel, there's been I would say at least an 80 or 90 year war between the Jewish right and the Jewish left inside Israel. And this is just, the latest iteration of it. The left, which has once dominated Israel, now is consigned to a minority. And the more in the minority they are, the more they cling to whatever, grasp of power they have, which in this case is the judiciary. And therefore they want, Israel to be ruled by the judiciary. And I think this is just how it plays out because they fear that, the demography means that, the Mizrahim and the religious are going to eventually just be the majority. And that'll be the end of sort of left-wing Israel.
Yeah. And that's what this whole business started in the 1990s with a justice named Aaron Barak. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned white minority rule. The Supreme Court, Israel Supreme Court, has all the hallmarks of white minority rule. They issue all these rulings. The Israeli public has no say whatsoever. The reason is, in America and in every democracy, the judges are appointed by the people, either in elections or by the elected class. One of the reasons you'll vote for a Democrat versus a Republican is, a Democrat's going to appoint a certain kind of judge and a Republican will appoint a certain kind of judge. And that's the way it's supposed to be in a democracy. In Israel, it doesn't work that way. The judges are appointed by an insular committee dominated by the judges themselves. So think about how that would work in America. We have a Supreme Court that's now 6-3 for the conservatives. If the judges replace themselves, you would always have a conservative court, always. And they could rule, forget about taking away the right to an abortion. They could ban abortion. They could rule that a fetus is a human being under the 14th Amendment, entitled to equal protection, and there's literally nothing you could do about it because the judges just replaced themselves. That's how it works in Israel. But instead of being a conservative court, it is a radically liberal court. That's the first aspect. The second is they have these crazy super rights. Not because the Israeli public gave them those rights, they arrogated those rights to themselves. It's called the Bank Mizrahi case. They issued it 2 days after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. So while the public was stunned and totally distracted, they ruled in some case, little commercial case that no one was paying attention to, that from now on, they have to approve everything in the country, and the standard is whatever they consider to be reasonable. Think about that for a minute. What made this blow up was they canceled an election because they said, this guy can't serve. It's not reasonable. The last hallmark of white minority rule is they're all white. Israel's Supreme Court has 15 members. The last time it had 15 members, long story. Right now they're a little short. 10 of them were what I call WASPs, white Ashkenazi secular with pull. 2 more were white, but they wore yarmulkes. The remaining 3, 2 were Sephardic Jews, 1 was an Arab. There's no ultra-Orthodox Jew who has ever served on the Israeli Supreme Court in history. There've only been a handful of Sephardic Jews, a handful of Arabs. It's basically a club, an insular club of WASPs. This is how white minority rule works. And this is what Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to dismantle, and they'll never forgive him for it.